I know I'm a little late to the game, as most people do their top 10 reads so far of the year halfway through the year. That's kind of a month ago now, but I'm doing it, we're here, we're doing it. This year has been a really good year for reading for me. I've read a lot of really good books, so I made a list of my top 10 of 2023 so far. In no particular order, book 1 is Network Effect, which is the 5th book in the Murderbot Diaries. The Murderbot Diaries starts with a series of novellas. There are 4 novellas, and then Network Effect is the first full-length novel, and I read this right at the start of the year. And Murderbot was already one of my favourite series of all time, but this is probably my favourite book in the series so far. It just does everything I love about Murderbot, but more fleshed out. Murderbot is a droid that is leased out to different companies for planetary exploration as a type of bodyguard. Each book kind of has its own mystery type plot. Despite the fact it is a novel, it is quite a short novel, it's only 350 pages-ish. But it is the character of Murderbot that makes this series. Murderbot doesn't really like people. It doesn't want to look after people. It wants to just stay by itself and watch its entertainment feed. However, despite this, it does get very connected to its clients, and seeing it evolve and learn to deal with people better over time is one of the most interesting parts about Murderbot. Seeing it evolve and the themes of social anxiety is part of why I love reading about Murderbot as a character. It's a very endearing character. There also is a fair bit of humour in the series, especially in Network Effect. I found myself bursting out laughing several times while reading this. The one thing that really stuck this out from the others was a really interesting structural choice. It has these sort of interludes that kind of looks like embedded code. And to start with, I just thought it was a really cool visual way to show bits of the past, but that does actually weave into the narrative at the end, and how they all come together. Top notch. I shout about this series all the time. If you've not read Murderbot yet, get on it. Next up, we have The Lessons Never Learned by Rob J. Hayes. This is the 2nd book in the War Eternal series. The first being Along the Razor's Edge, which was one of my favourite reads of last year. I can't talk too much about the plot because it is a sequel, but much like Murderbot, the thing that really drives this series up as a favourite for me is Eska, the character of Eska. Eska is kind of your chip in the shoulder, angsty, trying to get back at the world type character. But what I really love about this series, and the sequel in particular, is her story. So this is told from Eska in the future, looking back on the events of her life, and this very much feels like a story of legend coming to life. Feels like an autobiography of a legend. And I really like that this could be, if it was from someone else's perspective, it would change the story drastically. But because it's from her perspective, you can see why she's done some of the things that she's done. And even she says, people think I did this on purpose when I didn't, or I was about to collapse from exhaustion, but all these people were looking at me, so I'm holding up a strong front so it looks like I know what I'm doing. And what I love about book 2 is the bigger scope. We got a lot more of the world and the different races. There are these Rand and Yin, which are like these godlike beings that were in this war against each other, which is the War Eternal. I also felt like Eska went through the ringer with this book. Every time you think her life is getting a wee bit better, she just constantly gets kicked back down, and then it really shows you what that does to a person. And it's this promise that she's going to get worse and worse and becomes this moniker, the Corpse Queen, which we don't really know what that means. We just know that she's going to turn into this Corpse Queen. So it's following this descent into becoming the Corpse Queen. Also, if you like audiobooks, this series is amazing on audiobook. Next up, we have Jade War, the 2nd book in the Greenbone saga. Again, much like Along the Razor's Edge, I read Jade City last year, and I've not picked up Jade Legacy yet, but I did really enjoy Jade War. This was one that I read at the time and I wasn't sure what to think of it, because it was very political and very dialogue and conversation based instead of fighting and battle sequences. And I think the name Jade War made me think we were getting into some more fight scenes and action sequences, which we didn't really get much of in this book. However, the longer I sit with it, the more I really enjoyed it because of the characters and the political intrigue and all the really great scenes and moments in this book. So I do think it was because of the expectations. So just a heads up, if you're going to read this series, it's very much a political story. You're not going to get a lot of action and fighting sequences. The Greenbone Saga is a Godfather-esque gangster type clan story where we have these combating clans who are fighting for control over different territories in a country called Janloon. And the country of Janloon has this commodity called Jade, which are these green gemstones that give abilities to Greenbones. And one of the things I really like about this series is that you know no one is safe. Fond du Lis is happy to kill main characters, beat them up, throw them about, kill all their friends, and really just tear the heart out of the reader. And I've heard the Jade Legacy is only going to get more painful, so I'm really looking forward to picking up Jade Legacy before the end of the year. This should be no surprise if you've stuck about the channel for any length of time this year, but the Shadow Casket. The second book in the Dark Water Legacy, the first one being The Ember Blade. And I love this series. It's one of my favorite series of all time, and it's probably the one that I recommend the most. I think that most people will like it. This is a modernized classic fantasy in the realm of like Lord of the Rings. We have quests, magical items, we have lost lore and ancient histories and mysteries. We have a big fellowship type cast, ancient gods, soft-ish magic system, and it's just a whole lot of fun. One thing I really liked about book 2 in particular was how Chris Wooding handled the larger cast. We do get more characters joining from book 1, and I feel like a pitfall of bringing in all these characters is that some can fall to the wayside a bit, but Chris Wooding handled the larger cast so well. They were each given their own satisfying character arc, and just the ending. I also think that Chris Wooding's prose is just top tier. It just works perfectly for me. It's lyrical and it can have some really beautiful passages, but it's not overly metaphorical or bogged down with pages and pages of description work. It's just the right level for me personally that I can fly through it, love it, but it can also have some really nice words. You know what I mean. Next up, we have Tress of the Emerald Sea, which was the first secret project that Brandon Sanderson released this year. I did a review if you want to see my full thoughts, but this is a fairy tale-esque story following Tress, who lives on an island surrounded in a sea of spores. This is inspired by The Princess's Bride as well as other fairy tale type stories, and I feel like that really comes through in the prose in this book. Sanderson is known for his pretty accessible, laid-back, simple prose style, but I feel like this one is going for a more fairy tale style, and I think it works really well, and I wish and I really hope that he does more in this style because I really like it. And the reason he did that is because the story is told from the character Hoyd. If you don't know who Hoyd is, he's a world-hopping, storytelling, whatever Hoyd is. And Tress is content living on this little island, kind of away from the big bad world, until her friend Charlie is off island and needs rescuing. So we go off on a seafaring adventure across different seas of spores, not water, to try and rescue Charlie. And this really was just a lot of fun. And while we're at it, the next book on this list is Secret Project 3, Yumi and the Night Painter. It's my favourite of the 3 secret projects that have been released so far, and I believe it's also Sanderson's favourite, so if you're going to check out any of them, this is the one to check out. Again, I did a full video if you want to watch that, where I talk about my full thoughts about the book, but this follows 2 characters. We have Yumi, who is a chosen one who has a very ritual-based lifestyle, and she summons these spirits because each spirit that she summons will grant a wish. So all the local townsfolk queue up and she brings as many as she can and then goes through a quest. And these spirits are summoned by creative endeavors, and Yumi does this by stacking rocks. The second point of view is Painter, also known as Nakaro, but he kind of just calls himself Painter because he is a nightmare painter. He lives in a completely different setting. It's dark. He lives in the city that is surrounded in a shroud of pure darkness, and every night part of that darkness can form and sneak into the city, where it watches someone dreaming and then starts to create into this nightmare come alive. So to combat this, the city sends out painters every night, nightmare painters. They go out, and if they find these little trails and things, they follow it, and then they paint what the nightmare looks like, but as something mundane and non-threatening to disperse this nightmare before it becomes too powerful. The way that Sanderson created this book is just absolutely incredible. It's these two very different people in very different lifestyles, and the magic is really in this complementary narrative and character arc. This is inspired by like anime, and Final Fantasy X, Sanderson said, was a huge inspiration, and you can really see that with Yuna. But how everything comes together, and the twists and turns, and the interesting world building, and the complementary character arcs, it really is just a masterful storytelling in my opinion, and I absolutely loved it. It's great, you should go read it. Next up we have A Pilgrimage of Swords by Anthony Ryan. It's actually a series of novellas much like Murderbot, and I do really like fantasy novellas, just something a wee bit shorter to break up these longer novels, especially when you read 700-page plus chonkers. It's nice to break up with a short read. So I read A Pilgrimage of Swords, and I was blown away by how much I loved this novella. It follows this small party who are traveling across this wasteland of horrors to find this mad god that is said to grant one wish. This does so much of what I love about fantasy. Pretty standard classical setup, but none of these characters knew each other before they went together on this pilgrimage. So it's this anonymous group learning more about each other on this quest over this wasteland, where we come across lots of different creatures and places where we learn more about the world's history, all to find this mad god. This just feels like a really short first book, or a really long prologue to a series that I am desperate to continue. So if you're looking for a short read, highly recommend. Next up we have a book that I just finished recently, which is Neon Ghosts, A Witch's Sin. That's the series name, Neon Ghosts, by Daniel Green. This is one of those books that's super easy to sell. It's cyberpunk with vampires. Again, I did a full video if you want to watch that, but I had a lot of fun with this book. This follows Taya Mint, an enforcer who's kind of like a mercenary who roughs up criminals. This is until she gets pulled into a bigger political situation. But this has such an interesting and unique setup. So humans have moved into these mega structures because outside there was this haze that kills people, so they all had to hide inside these metal buildings with hundreds and hundreds of floors. And in a world where they all hide inside this grey metal building that's very dull, and because they've not seen the sun for generations, they all get very pale. They have a wear called glow. It's kind of like tattoos, but they glow. And you can get glow in your eyes and pretty much all over your body if you want. That's one of the things that this book does really well, is it has a lot of style and unique aspects to it. I really liked the leaning into the more supernatural side of it as well. It wasn't something that I was expecting, but I do like we get more of a background to the vampires. They're very much not just tacked on. And the character work with Taya is really good. The first 2/3 are good, but the last third, top notch. It's cyberpunk with vampires. You'll want to read it, trust me. And last, but certainly not least, we have The Book That Wouldn't Burn, which, there's a theme here, I also have a full video for. Now this is a very unusual and bizarre story. It follows two characters. We have Levira, who lives out on the dust, which is just this huge desert, and then we have Evar, that lives inside this massive grand library. But Evar and his two brothers and sister are trapped in this room in the library, and they cannot get out, but they've lived there pretty much their entire lives. And it pulls together these two individuals into this huge mystery with the library and why it's there, where it came from, and leans into a lot of themes about knowledge and progression as a society. It's an incredibly unique story. I've not read anything else like it, and it is really well done on how he pulls together all these themes, and piecing together this mystery of the library is just so much fun. It's a really difficult book to talk about, but if you want to know more, I have got a full video. I highly recommend it. And I went into this blind. I knew very little about it, and I think that is probably the best way to consume it. You probably will be a bit confused at the start. I certainly was, but it does become clear over time. So that will do it for today. Those were my top 10 reads of 2023 so far. Hopefully my top 10 at the end of the year will have lots of new and great books. Let me know, what is your favorite read of 2023 so far in the comments below. And a raw book, this is probably the best book I've read this year by far. Definitely worth reading. Thanks very much for watching. Outro. If shoes can second as necklaces, why can't necklaces second as shoes?